Welcome back to the Historica Studio channel. Today, we're taking an unforgettable journey through more than 5 centuries of history, from the arrival of European explorers in 1492 to the America of 2026. Together, we'll witness the rise of colonies, the fight for independence, the Civil War, industrial transformation, world wars, technological revolutions, and the events that shaped one of the world's most influential nations. So sit back, relax, and let's explore the entire history of America from 1492 to 2026. Before 1492, this land stretched across an entire continent of silence, forests, rivers, and civilizations that had already risen and fallen for thousands of years. And then, in a single moment in history, ships appeared on the horizon. What followed was not just the discovery of a new world, but the collision of 2 worlds that would reshape everything: land, power, belief, and human destiny itself. Empires would rise here. Revolutions would be born here. Wars would burn across it. And in the end, it would become the most powerful nation the world had ever seen. But none of it was inevitable, and nothing about it was peaceful. Stand on the edge of the Atlantic Ocean in the late 15th century, and you would see nothing but endless water stretching into mystery. No maps could tell you what lay beyond it. No certainty existed about what waited on the other side. Then in 1492, ships crossed that boundary. When Christopher Columbus landed in the Caribbean, he believed he had reached Asia. Instead, he had stepped into a world that had never been connected to Europe, Africa, or Asia in this way before. But this was not an empty land. It was a living world, home to millions of people, complex societies, vast trade networks, secret cities, and histories older than Europe's empires. What followed would become one of the most dramatic transformations in human history. Disease would spread faster than armies. Entire civilizations would collapse, and a new society would begin to form slowly, violently, permanently. This is not just the story of a country. This is the story of how a continent was remade, and how that remaking created a nation that would one day shape the entire planet. Long before ships arrived from Europe, the land that would become the United States was already filled with life, complexity, and power. Across forests, plains, deserts, and coastlines, hundreds of indigenous nations thrived. Some lived in massive agricultural cities with engineered landscapes, while others moved with the seasons, following herds, rivers, and ecological cycles older than memory. In the Mississippi Valley, large earthen cities rose as centers of trade and ceremony that connected distant regions through vast exchange networks. In the Southwest, stone-built communities clung to cliffs and desert mesas, shaped by generations of adaptation to harsh environments. Along the Pacific Northwest, societies built intricate systems of fishing, woodworking, and social hierarchy tied deeply to the ocean's rhythm. There was no single America. There were thousands of Americas, each with its own language, its own laws, its own understanding of the world. Time itself was measured differently. Land was not owned in the European sense. It was lived with, honored, and shared through systems of responsibility and tradition. But far across the ocean, another world was preparing to collide with this one. Europe was expanding, navigation was improving, and kingdoms were searching for new routes, new wealth, and new power. The stage was set for contact that would change everything, and it would begin with a voyage that was supposed to go somewhere else entirely. When Columbus landed in the Caribbean, he described the land with wonder. But wonder quickly turned into misunderstanding. Europe did not see a continent filled with nations. It saw territory, it saw opportunity, and soon, it saw conquest. What began as exploration became extraction. Gold, land, labor, everything was to be claimed. But the greatest force unleashed was not human. It was biological. Diseases carried unknowingly across the ocean spread through indigenous populations with devastating speed. Entire communities vanished in a single generation. Villages were abandoned. Cultural knowledge was lost before it could be passed on. The land did not become empty, but it became destabilized in a way no military force could have achieved alone. Into this vacuum, European colonies began to form. Spanish, French, Dutch, and eventually English settlements appeared along coastlines and rivers. At first, survival was fragile. Early colonies struggled with starvation, conflict, and isolation. But over time, they adapted, and they expanded. What had begun as contact became colonization, and colonization became permanent settlement. The foundations of a new society were being laid built on displacement, survival, trade, and increasingly, forced labor. A new world was forming, but it would not remain small for long. By the 1600s, English settlements along the Atlantic coast had grown into structured colonies. Cities began to appear, harbors filled with ships, markets filled with goods, streets shaped by European planning but adapted to a new land. Life was harsh. Winters were brutal. Disease was common. Survival depended on trade, agriculture, and constant expansion into new territory. As colonies grew, so did tensions between settlers and indigenous nations, and later between the colonies themselves and the distant rule of the British Crown. A new identity was slowly forming. Not fully European, not yet American, something in between. The Atlantic Ocean no longer felt like the edge of the world. But wonder quickly turned into misunderstanding. Europe did not see a continent filled with nations. It saw territory, it saw opportunity, and soon, it saw conquest. What began as exploration became extraction. Gold, land, labor, everything was to be claimed. But the greatest force unleashed was not human. It was biological. Diseases carried unknowingly across the ocean spread through indigenous populations with devastating speed. Entire communities vanished in a single generation. Villages were abandoned. Cultural knowledge was lost before it could be passed on. The land did not become empty, but it became destabilized in a way no military force could have achieved alone. Into this vacuum, European colonies began to form. Spanish, French, Dutch, and eventually English settlements appeared along coastlines and rivers. At first, survival was fragile. Early colonies struggled with starvation, conflict, and isolation. But over time, they adapted, and they expanded. What had begun as contact became colonization, and colonization became permanent settlement. The foundations of a new society were being laid built on displacement, survival, trade, and increasingly, forced labor. A new world was forming, but it would not remain small for long. By the 1600s, English settlements along the Atlantic coast had grown into structured colonies. Cities began to appear, harbors filled with ships, markets filled with goods, streets shaped by European planning but adapted to a new land. Life was harsh. Winters were brutal. Disease was common. Survival depended on trade, agriculture, and constant expansion into new territory. As colonies grew, so did tensions between settlers and indigenous nations, and later between the colonies themselves and the distant rule of the British Crown. A new identity was slowly forming. Not fully European, not yet American, something in between. The Atlantic Ocean no longer felt like the edge of the world. It had become a bridge of commerce, ideas, and control. But control always creates resistance, and resistance would soon ignite into revolution. By the 1770s, the American colonies were no longer just distant settlements. They were growing economies, with their own political ideas, their own leaders, and their own sense of independence. But they were still ruled by a distant empire. Taxes increased. Representation was denied. Tensions sharpened. And in cities like Boston, Philadelphia, and New York, anger began to turn into action. Then came the breaking point. Protests became boycotts. Boycotts became rebellion. And rebellion became war. The American Revolution was not a quick or clean conflict. It was chaotic, uncertain, and deeply uneven. Battles were fought in fields, forests, and freezing winters. Armies struggled for supplies. Civilians were caught between loyalties. But something new was being forged in the struggle. I believe that a nation could be built not on kings or emperors but on ideas. Liberty, representation, self-governance. When independence was finally declared, it did not end conflict. It began a new experiment. A fragile nation had been born, and it was not yet clear whether it would survive. In the early 19th century, the United States began to expand westward. Land that had been home to indigenous nations for centuries was increasingly taken through treaties, pressure, and force. New territories opened. New states formed. The country stretched across mountains, rivers, and plains. It was a time of movement and ambition. But beneath it all lay a growing contradiction. The nation declared freedom as its founding principle, yet millions lived in slavery. Cotton plantations in the South became engines of global commerce. Factories in the North began to rise. Railroads stitched distant regions together. Cities grew rapidly. Immigration increased. America was transforming from a young republic into an industrializing power. But the question it could not answer was simple and unavoidable. Could a nation built on freedom survive a system built on bondage? That question would soon be answered in fire. The tension finally broke in 1861. The United States split into two opposing sides. What followed was the most destructive conflict in its history. Brother fought against brother. Fields became battlefields. Cities were destroyed. Hundreds of thousands died. The war was not just about land. It was about the definition of the nation itself. When it ended, slavery was abolished, but the country that emerged was permanently changed. Reconstruction began. A fragile attempt to rebuild unity followed, but the scars of war remained deeply embedded in society, and the nation, though reunited, was entering a new era of power and complexity. After the Civil War, America transformed at an unprecedented speed. Steel cities rose. Skyscrapers pierced the sky. Railroads connected coast to coast. Immigrants arrived in massive waves, seeking opportunity and survival. Factories ran day and night. Fortunes were built quickly. Inequality also grew rapidly. This was an age of invention and exploitation. Electricity changed daily life. Telephones connected distant voices. Cities became crowded, loud, and vertical. America was no longer just expanding. It was accelerating. And soon, it would step onto the global stage. At first, the United States remained distant from global conflict, but eventually, it was pulled into the world wars that reshaped the 20th century. Factories became war machines. Soldiers crossed oceans. Entire economies were reorganized for survival and victory. By the end of World War II, the world order had changed. Empires collapsed. New superpowers emerged, and the United States stood at the center of a rebuilt global system. Its cities were intact. Its industry was unmatched. Its influence was global. A new era had begun. The decades after World War II were defined by tension without direct war. The United States and the Soviet Union became rivals, shaping global politics, technology, and culture. Space exploration pushed humanity beyond Earth. Cities expanded into suburbs. Television reshaped culture. Civil rights movements challenged long-standing inequalities within the nation itself. America was powerful, but also deeply divided in many ways. Then came a moment that changed everything again. A moment that introduced a new kind of vulnerability in a modern world. At the start of the 21st century, the United States entered an era defined by uncertainty, technology, and global interconnection. After 9/11's, wars reshaped foreign policy and domestic life. The internet transformed communication, economy, and identity. Smartphones placed global information into every hand. Social media changed how people saw the world and each other. Economic crises tested stability. Political divisions deepened. Yet innovation accelerated faster than ever before. Artificial intelligence, space exploration, biotechnology, and digital economies began to redefine what society could become. By 2026, the United States remains a nation of contradictions. Powerful yet divided. Innovative yet struggling with inequality. Influential yet constantly evolving. Its history is not finished. It is still unfolding. From 1492 to 2026, the land called America has been remade again and again. From forests and ancient civilizations, to colonies, to revolution, to empire-level power in a global world. Every era built on the one before it. Every transformation came at a cost, and every generation believed it was living at the turning point of history. But perhaps the most important truth is this: history here never moved in a straight line. It surged, collapsed, rebuilt, and changed direction over and over again. And it still is. The story of America is not a finished chapter. It is an ongoing experiment in power, identity, and survival. And what comes next will depend on the choices still being made today. If you enjoyed this journey through time, subscribe for more cinematic history documentaries. And tell us in the comments what country or civilization you want to walk through next.